I play. All right, let's go back a chapter. Not a chapter. A paragraph. Maybe more. Progressive resided. Okay, hold on. However, before any progressive within the developing world can get down to working out the economic minutia, minutia. Let me make sure of that word real quick. I think I kind of glazed over that word without looking it up. Just real quick. I want to make sure I'm saying it correctly. Nope. M-I-N-U-T-I-A-E. Please say it for me.
Minutiae.
Minutiae, which means it's the small, precise, or trivial details of something. So it's called
Minutiae.
Minutiae. The developing world can get down to working out the economic minutiae they have to deal with the political problems. Indeed, the tendency on the part of the progressive group within these developing world countries to invade the issue of getting at the political preconditions to economic development is itself a problem of underdevelopment. In my own days as a undergrad at the University of West Indies, several of us did sit down and try to work out the schema concerning what the new political economy would look like. There was no dearth to talk about the society should look like. Many socialists in Africa, Asia, and Latin America have been dealing with that issue for a long time. But it is only a very few tiny minorities who have been concerned with trying to analyze the movements of history as it is subsequently to determine what actions was needed to obtain political leverage. In other words, the question of power was being avoided. And without that, one is only talking about blueprints, which is essentially an occupation for idle bourgeoisie philosophers. Good evening, Asha. Hello. Win gifts. Yeah, win gifts, guys. Good job. All right, back up. I just saw a whole bunch of things coming in. Within respects to tackling the problem of power, there is required more detailed social analysis than merely saying that we have on the one hand the enemy, who are the metropolitan capitalists, and on the other hand the exploited developing world. We have to make a closer analysis of the types of societies which have been created within the developing world to inquire as to what are the potential openings for a struggle to change the situation. Nationalist movements, almost by definition, tended to obscure the paper over the kinds of internal contradictions that exist in their societies. And when they achieved constitutional independence, it very often came as a shock to realize that the internal contradictions were playing a much more crucial and determining role than had previously been allocated to them. Only a small number of progressives in the developing world are exempt from this stricture. It's not structure because it's not you. It's stricture. The majority failed to make a clear analysis of the society which had allowed them to locate within their own society the forces of change and the forces of reaction. The probable reason is that the social strata exist in the developing world countries manifest the variety of forms that were not necessarily encountered in the metropoles. So the developing world intellectuals who may have taken the progressive orientation forming from a Marxist framework still found themselves unable to understand their own society, to the extent that they failed to distinguish between the tools that they acquired from abroad and the conclusions that they were introduced. from abroad. This is a very common misconception. Having adopted Marxism or scientific socialism as a framework of analysis, one may or may not apply a creatively to its own environment. Besides, developing world intellectuals are very fascinated by models that are historically applicable to societies outside of their own. The principal model was Russia at one time, while later it became China. There are very few who have the courage, because it doesn't take a lot of courage and a lot of energy to deal with their own situations and to come up with the relevant answers. One of the developing world social groups readily identify as having its own particularities as a petite bourgeoisie. There is a national bourgeoisie in India and Brazil and in parts of Latin America, but it is not a general phenomenon within the developing world. But by and large, the personnel who control the reins of power undoubtedly adhere to the norms of values of the bourgeoisie in the metropoles, but they do not control any capital formation. At best, they own 2 or 3 houses, and they own 1 Mercedes-Benz plus a Volkswagen, and so forth. But these are not capitalists. We must formulate a position that allows us to see the dependency of this class, its roots in the international bourgeoisie and the particularities which develop from that. I myself prefer to portray them as a stratum within the international capitalist class, a stratum serving the international capitalist class. And in each situation, one has to examine their particular characteristics, including their behavior pattern. I'm thinking he's talking about how like imperialist capitalists, international capitalists set up bourgeois comprador class within the countries that they're pillaging. I think that's what he's talking about right now. So let's go on. In Africa and in the West Indies, the petite bourgeoisie display characteristics such as self-hate, because they are usually black men who have a certain white orientation. They have what is correctly identified as oh my gosh, imitiveness. Let me find out what this word means, or at least hear it. Watch, I'll spell it out and I'll be able to do it. Every time I spell it out, it works. Well, not every time. Oh my gosh. Come on. I want you to press the word. There's 2 T's. Come on, let me say it. It won't let me do it. Hold on again. I don't. Oh my gosh, why did it do that? I didn't do that. Come on, stop doing that. Stop. Fucking hell. Come on. You hear it? Let me hear it.
Imitative.
Imitativeness. Okay. They have what is correctly identified as imitativeness, a lack of creativity, which were not characteristics of the European bourgeoisie in its heyday. The European bourgeoisie was a entrepreneurial bourgeoisie. In the Caribbean, or in Africa, the only entrepreneurship that the petite bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie, are capable of buying a truck or investing in real estate. They have neither the capital nor the kind of aggressiveness which is required to engage in capital enterprise. The point at issue is that progressive within the third developing world countries have to confront the problems of development almost exclusively in the relationships to local particularism. That's weird. What are the forces existing in the society, and how does one begin to organize to confront the recognized enemy? How does one begin to reach the masses, who are essentially peasant masses, with a very small minority of workers in the traditional industrial sense of the word? I would like to reflect briefly on these questions with regard to one part of East Africa, one where I am fortunate to possess firsthand a very reliable secondhand information. Uganda. Uganda is an intriguing case. In Uganda, under Milton Obote, progressive groups where the existence and had to make a decision on how to participate in actualizing Uganda's development. Looking at their national society, they saw a phenomenon that was becoming increasingly evident in the developing world, namely a government that could be easily be classified as being either fish or fowl. A government that was making certain rhetorical statements about socialism, about, quote, and moving to the left. A government that within the context of African liberation was anti-apartheid, anti-Smith regime, anti-imperialist in its rhetoric, and therefore a government that one could not place in the same anti-communist and Western, pro-Western bracket as that of Malawi's Hastings Mbanda, or led by Felix, oh my gosh, Homfanit Goni in the Ivory Coast. And yes, at the same time, when the Ugandan progressives look at Ugandan society, they knew that it was no different from the society in Ivory Coast, a very little different from the society of Malawi. There was the same continuation of exploitation of the peasantry in Uganda and Ugandan countryside, and the same rapid increase in wealth in terms of consumer goods and land of a smaller elite. It was an elite that to some extent had a base in the, quote, traditional quasi-feudal structures, along with a new elite of intellectuals and government officials, the new party officials, and so on. In effect, Ugandan militants recognized a new neocolonialism was running rampant within Ugandan society, having ambivalence on their part derived from the ambiguity caused by Obote's preempting of certain socialist terminology, thus making it difficult for socialists to come out and completely denounce him. So the socialists in Uganda began to work out a strategy for their particular situation. It was a strategy for immediate political action, and it was tantamount to a strategy of development. They recognized that first they needed to establish an organization of their own. This is a real problem in developing world countries, especially where the government is playing games. How does one establish an organization of one's own? It appeared that there were groups in Uganda who were concentrating to resolving the problems. You notice that they mentioned quasi-feudal and peasantry. This is why it's important that we, like, as Maoists, at least as Maoists, we look at the whole revolution, like what the Brazilian Maoist movement is talking about. The new democratic revolution is the main force of the world proletarian revolution, because the semi-colonial, semi-feudal sense and the lack of the proletariat, a lack of workers. At the same time, they had to decide that they must participate to a certain extent within the politics of Uganda and within the politics of the ruling party. Obote, Uganda's People's Congress, UPC, Some of these individuals were in fact prepared to run an election scheduled by Obote. I can't say that. Obote. He had scheduled a very fancy election where a single candidate was to appear in about 4 constituencies simultaneously. The election never materialized because of the coup. But some of these individuals were prepared to participate in those elections. Eventually, of course, the coup interrupted this, and Ugandan progressives were then faced with the situation where a government that was more clearly rightist, a government that was more clearly neo-colonialist, had come to power. Some Ugandan militants had predicated the military coup a testimony to their insights into their own society, and yet their response to the new clique was far from uncompromising. Several among them produced rationalizations which permitted them to associate with a regime that was more blatantly opposed to the interests of the quote common man. In Uganda, in Uganda then was the case under Obote. I can't say Obot. Oh my gosh, Kobado, who was appointed foreign minister, was previously one of the shining lights of Ugandan's left, and apparently still retains pretensions to socialism. Only a tiny fragment denounced the coup and began to take steps which qualified to be called revolutionary and which kept in sight the objective of people's power. We did this. Oh my gosh, I gotta do another word. To stay on. Do. Let's find out.
Inept.
Okay, we did this ineptness, disintegration, and collaboration arise on the part of groups who claim to perceive the essential line of solutions to their own development problems. It does suggest a lack of serious analytical framework, although many of those involved claim to be Marxists. Besides that, however, lack of self-confidence and a degree of opportunism also entered the picture. The new situation posed by the, Idi Amin takeover, however, would have required the boldness to break completely with the state machinery and to operate entirely outside the boundaries of petite bourgeoisie politics. Instead, several of the progressives came up with a lame alternative of, quote, working within the system, end quote. The fobbed off many revolutionary Ugandan youth by saying that Amin was amenable to the device from the quote leftists. The paradox of progressives seeking to give advice to reactionary governments is not new. There is a long history of this in Latin America, because Latin America has had many progressive economists and other social scientists who spent a lot of time advising a curious government that arise in that part of the world. The paradox reveals that from the viewpoint of groups grappling with the problem of development in the developing world, the roots of the problem are political beings and strictly linked with the questions of political power. The Ugandans would see. Oh, let me take a drink. Water's good. The Ugandans would seem to have accepted this under. Oh my gosh, I can't say his name. Obote. Obito. I can't. And then to have renegade. Oh my gosh, I gotta do this word now. Come on. R-E-N-E-G. I think it's renegade.
Renege.
Oh, reneged. Okay. And then they have reneged on their responsibilities in this regards subsequent to the coup. Nevertheless, one does not have to be pessimistic about the outcome. What is happening in Uganda and other arenas is that the contradictions keep multiplying day by day. The creation of the militaristic or police state itself polarizes the forces and causes people to react against the regime, if only for the sake of survival. If on the other hand, the regime is flirting with anti-imperialist socialist ideas without any commitment, then it requires only a few years before the rhetoric is exhausted and the period of reckoning begins. Inevitably, behind the facade of pseudo-progressive assertions, corruption increases, and police brutality also. I am not at all pessimistic about the long-term prospects for liberation and development in the developing world. The propping up of regimes by imperialists is a short-term solution. Objective conditions in the developing world are worsening, as I suggested earlier. The living conditions of the vast majority of people are deteriorating. That is what will maintain the initiatives towards changing and propelling the developing world out of the counter-revolutionary phase which arose from formal independence. Besides, there is a factor of racism which is all pervasive throughout the developing world, which is particularly strong where black people live in Africa and in the Caribbean. It is a unifying factor. Imperialism has used racism in its own interest, but it turns out to be a double-edged blade, and the very unity that is engendered among black people, the unity of common conditions and common exploitation of oppression, is being turned around as a weapon to be used against imperialism. To conclude, let me take another. Water's good right now. I like it. I'm going back real quick. Not many people. All right. To conclude, perhaps the most important reasons for confidence and for the revolutionary optimism with respect to both the political problems, which is immediate, and the long-term economic problems, is that the peoples of the developing world have not been dehumanized in spite of everything, in spite of slavery, in spite of colonialism. The historical records will show that it is the peoples of the metropoles who have gone through the most dehumanization. That's the way it is. Slavery has dehumanized slave masters more than it has dehumanized slaves. Colonialism has dehumanized the colonists, the colonials, more than has dehumanized the colonial people. The working class of the metropoles is more confused, more alienated, and less in control of their own destiny than the peasants in the African countryside and the workers on the plantation in the developing world countries. The latter do not have any crumbs or fruits that have been thrown at them to increase their confusion, nor have they been alive nor have they been living within a society which assails them on all sides with a variety of myths that cloud exploitation under the banner of God and country, and so on. Ultimately, it seems to me that freedom will come from those who are the most oppressed. Slaves rather than slave masters are the repositories of freedom. Liberation will come from those who are not yet liberated, and human dignity will be reasserted by those who are not yet dehumanized. I think what he's talking about is that the peasantry and all that see the egregious exploitation and stuff, and they know where it's coming from, where the other ones are succumbing, like liberalism. Liberalism masks and shields the true realities of things, and gives like the white aristocracy these little things and stuff like that to keep them subdued and secluded. So I could see how that can be the point. Like most indigenous people, they probably see how colonialism is playing a factor in how the United States maintains colonies. You know what I mean? I'm not saying everybody, because that would be general. There are probably people that are still succumb to the propaganda and liberalism. So I can understand that his position on that part. Question and answers. Question. All right, let's go through this. Would you consider the more important problems of imperialism to be the ones created by neocolonialism, or those belonging to an old capitalist experience of imperialism? Answer. The old imperialism is falling apart. One has to be more sensitive about the new changes. There are very powerful existing areas of old imperialism as in South Africa, but the issue are clearly defined. Whatever the strength of the white minority regimes of a Portuguese colonialism backed by NATO and by foreign monopoly capital and stage is set, and armed struggles are already unleashed. And in those areas, I think it is easier to mobilize politically where colonialism is open and blatant in the old-fashioned form. A new colonialism is sometimes so difficult to decipher that one might think that one is doing something progressive when in fact one is really being co-opted by the system. Take nationalization as an example. There was a time back in early 50s when people who nationalized were automatically regarded as progressive nationalists and socialists, and imperialism moved against them to squash them immediately. But now nationalization has become a technique that can just as well be used by enemies as by progressive Africans, Asians, and Latin Americans. Nationalizing a plant within the context of the international division of labor and the international allocation of resources could well mean that production is more independent than if it had remained in the hands of foreign enterprises. A joint venture in which the government takes over 51% of the shares may superficially suggest control, while in practice, the 51% comprise the problems of labor management, and their 49% comprise the profits. There are all kinds of new techniques that are being devised by international capital. After all, mosquitoes today are able to cope with the DDT insecticide. Similarly, imperialism has a certain flexibility, and I think the new forms and adjustments are maybe more difficult to combat because they are subtle, and there is a time lag before it can be appreciated. And imperialism has also turned retreat into success. Interesting. Hey, Sego. If you're just passing by, it's understandable. Question. Could you analyze the Tanzanian situation? Answer. Tanzania is one of the few instances where I think that the nationalist government, which inherited power at independence, does provide a framework within a struggle can be conducted. Both things have to be recognized. First, that is, nationalist governments does provide a legitimate framework for onward development. And second, that a struggle is nevertheless necessary. One then has to determine what exactly is the struggle. Who is struggling against whom? What is the alignment of forces? There is a very useful analysis by young Tanzanians, which is entitled Tanzania, the silent class struggle. It is a silent class struggle because it does not take the form of armed struggle. Instead, it takes the form of a great deal of maneuvering within the structures between on the one hand, the bureaucracy and the reactionary elements on the petite bourgeoisie, the petty, and on the other hand, a much smaller group commitment of socialism, who are attempting very slowly and with a great deal of difficulty to try to establish some links with the vast majority of the people. Meanwhile, the workers themselves have to find ways and means of confronting the petty bourgeoisie. Within this structure, within the idiom of socialism, a struggle is going on all the time. Many individuals who are justifiably happy about what is going on in Tanzania sometimes romanticize the situation because they do not know how difficult the struggle is, and they do not realize that it is a struggle that has produced not only gains for the working people, but also many setbacks from day to day. Question: what role is being played by nationalized sectors and by the trade unions in Tanzania? Answer: nationalization is a step in a forward direction. The next issue becomes the method of running these enterprises. Nationalized industry is a fairly small sector because Tanzania is not an industrialized country. But what goes on within is significant in ideological and political terms, apart from the economic implications. A bureaucracy has been developed. This is not unique. It happened in the Soviet Union. It happened in China. It happened in Cuba. The bureaucracy has emerged as a social formation crucial to socialist development or lack thereof, even where the property base of an exploited class has been liquidated, so that it is a very real problem in the nationalized sectors. How does one deal with it? In Tanzania, there has been talk about workers control in the factories. It has never reached the point of workers control in practice, but there has been over the past year a very healthy self-assertion by the workers. This has not taken place through the trade unions, which is virtually defunct. Workers in their own factories have been reasserting themselves in Tanzania, particularly since the TAMI guidelines, which Tanzanians refer to as the Mwangazo. There has been a spat of worker manifestation, which have taken these guidelines as their credo, because the guidelines say that the country has to create a new style of work, new kinds of relationships between the party and the government, the officials and the bureaucrats, and the workers and peasants. And this is getting at the root of the problem of the rise of the new bureaucracy and its relationship politically and socially in the rest of the population. Workers in their factories uses Mwanganzo as a sort of article of faith, having been attacking the bureaucracy, have been attacking the managers and the officials who have been placed over them. Strikes and worker stoppages, therefore, often mirror in a small way the ongoing struggle between people who are directly at the production line and those who are supposedly making policies in society. That is one facet of the silent class struggle. And we're going to look up this word, because it sounds like it's like a little red book. I think. I'm not too sure. I can't remember. We're going to find it out. I don't know how to say it. MWONGOZO. What is it? Let's find out. It's a Swahili word that means guide or guidance. Okay. But it can also refer to a specific document and places such as a code of governance for state, corporations in Tanzania, It is also the name of a college. Okay, so it's also the name of a college. But they're talking about the Swahili words for guidance and stuff like that. That's what they're talking about. That's what they're talking. They gave them something to be able to have guidance and direction so they can challenge their bureaucratic state and have the struggle. Yeah. Yep. Going back a little bit, no one said anything, but that's okay. What does the AI say? AI hasn't said anything. All right. Okay. Chapter 9. Slavery and underdevelopment. So my inquiry here is we're going to find out how slavery has kept things underdeveloped. In evaluating the two connected concepts of slavery and underdevelopment, the principal emphasize must necessarily be on underdevelopment. Slavery as institution, as epoch, as mode of production, acquires its significance in this formulation from an awareness of the implications of inequality and dependency in the modern world. Fail to grasp this multiple manifestations of underdevelopment as a contemporary phenomenon inevitably leads to an obscuring of historical issues. Multinational corporations, management contracts, blockages of technology transfer, and the rise of new dependent class structures in the so-called developing world provides the local starting point for historical inquiries. No doubt it is for this reason that within the field of African study, the most effective analysis of the development process have been authored by economists, culture anthropologists, and political scientists. While historians remain locked within time capsule, it is against the background of the considerable advance of theoretical and scientific work on underdevelopment that one might resume in a new way the already long established debate on the role of slavery. The notion of underdevelopment has emerged out of a series of debate. There have been varying empirical observations from territory to territory and varying emphasis on the constituents of underdevelopment, the constituents. Yet all approaches to underdevelopment as a historical process have discerned the presence of giving tendencies towards inequalities, backwardness, and dependency. This tendency are operative. Oh my gosh, I gotta hear it. I'm having problems with simple words today. Don't know why. Operative at most times, although they might ultimately be transcended. It's funny how I got the other words. It is, for instance, observable that inequity, and dependence are self-enforcing, but the decisive and obvious exception is provided by the transition from a peripheral role in colonial North America to the hegemonic position of the U.S. within the capitalist/imperialist world. Today, the discussion continues, focusing on the potentialities of Brazil and India and other semi-industrialized, quote-unquote, or intermediaries, quote-unquote, economies. In terms of modern monopoly capital, it is preferable to identify the forms of surplus realization and accumulation without prejudice to the possibilities that, quote, underdevelopment can give way to, quote, independent development. In certain sectors of the periphery, these modifications in the approach of underdevelopment hardly apply to the period of slavery, since it predates monopoly capitalism. As a premise of this chapter, underdevelopment will be held to be an integral part of the development of capitalism on the world scale. This is not necessarily self-evident, but the arguments to this effect have been made at such length elsewhere that they have to be taken as a given in this context. The expanded reproduction of capital and the creation of the world system involves the realization of surplus and its extraction from all regions within the ambit of capital. This meant not merely the extension of economic activity from one continent to another, but also the juxtaposition, which means side by side, parallel, of several different social formations and modes of production, articulated in such a way as to secure the dominance of capitalist relations, as well as the transfer of value to the capitalist class in the core areas. The search for greater precision and determining when capitalism became a dominant mode in Europe is beyond the present exercises, and so too is the estimation of the impact of New World slavery on the emergence of capitalism in Europe. However, these questions do have relevance to the distinction between, quote, commercial capital and, quote, industrial capital, and to that between commodity production of wage labor and commodity production by means of wage labor. Oh, wait, let me read that. Between a commodity production by wage labors and commodity production by means other than wage labor. There we go. These latter issues are directly pertinent to the role of slavery in the history of underdevelopment in Africa and the Americas. The slavery which existed in the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries coexisted with other modes of production in Europe, Africa, and America. These were articulated to constitute a system which a capacity for further physical expansion, and one which achieve alter alia the follow. 1. The accumulation of capital. 2. The forms of combining and organizing capital. 3. Qualitative leaps in production and of technology. 4. The development of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And 5. A strengthening of the state and other basic social institutions. Because the state is a monopoly on violence, and it's ran by the bourgeoisie, the ruling class. Any exploration of the links between slavery and underdevelopment should seek to assess the contribution of slavery to the lopsidedness of the above points. More than that, one needs to be more confident that the contribution by slavery was essential and unique at decisive junctures. No scholars have expressed doubt as to the enormous significance of European overseas expansion and the Atlantic trade in particular. The stumbling blocks are to be found beyond these innocuous phrases when attempting to assign weight to slavery and the slave trade. Africa still receives short shrifts of conventional text on the subject of Atlantic trade. Yet, whenever the subject has been explored, it emerges that Africa was historically indispensable to the leading class forces of Europe. The feudal landed classes who participated in overseas expansion would have been unable to renew themselves in the form of quasi-feudal plantations and land grants, and the nascent capitalist class needed the new world to redress the social balance in the old. They did so by integrating the Americas into the network of financial and market relations dominated by themselves in the metropolitan centers. Africa also helped to extend the market by cheap European manufacturers and to strengthen the techniques of guaranteeing capital and credit. But, of course, Africa's key role was a supplier of labor for which there were no alternatives at the time. Africa was structurally marginal to the emergent world system of the 16th and 17th centuries. In strict terms, one could not have in fact say that African society had become integrated into the world economy. Wallerstein argues pervasively as follows. Let's see what he says. But why Africans as the new slave? Because Europe needed a source of labor from a reasonable, well-populated region that was accessible and relatively near the region of usage. But it had to be formed from a region which was outside its world economy, so that Europe could feel unconcerned about the economic consequences for the breeding region of wide-scale removal of manpower as slaves. That's what he said. Only rarely did Africa supply value of labor directly to Europe, and for the most part, its linkage were via the American continent. In the apt terms of Samir Amin, Africa's function as a periphery of American periphery, as a periphery of a periphery. Africa was raided rather than cultivated. The political commercial nexus was rather fragile. European forts changed hands among the different nation states and sometimes fell under the sway of local African rulers. The more vulnerable slave barracoons were in effect tolerated by African authorities, while both the European and African trade factors on the coast had to be allocated considerable amounts of commercial credits on mere trust. But the paradox of structural marginality and immense historical significance also applied with regards to the impact of the slave trade in Africa itself. Large parts of the continent supplied labor at the coast to itself, which must be measured in terms of production and physical and social reproduction. Unfortunately, there has been no predictable accumulation to new data to clarify the question of slave trade within African society. Available statistical information was compiled and tabulated as a, quote, slave trade census by Philip Curtin. This was hailed in some quarters as indicating that prior to estimates were grossly exaggerated, and that consequently one must scale down considerably conceptions of the destructive effects of slaving on African society. The Curtin figures were, of course, oriented towards the Americas, and he indicated that they could not have held to be definitive for Africa. Give or take their own imperfections, figures for Africa's landed alive in the Americas or even embarked on slave ships offered no more than a framework in which further extrapolations are required to proximate number lost in African society and to relate quantity of quality. This would have called for further regional and general studies to examine the mechanisms of slave procurement and the direct consequences in the demographic, social, economic, and political spheres. One is still left with the necessity to speculate, partly because of the inefficiency of studies and partly because certain data may well be irrecoverable. Hold on a second, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome in. Surmising or theorizing about the relationship of slaving to African development may be done plausibly by inferring from general principles of pervasively, by hiding behind and supposed lack of proof. Thus, oh my gosh, here we go. INIKORI contends that a much higher population loss must be inferred from projections having to do with the removal of Africans in their productive prime. He contends further that the diseconomies in the utilization of the basic factors of production, labor, meant that even a neoclassical theoretical approach should logically deduce that the slave trade applied to brake on African growth and development. John Fagg, on the other hand, emphasized that there is no evidence to suggest that the operations of slaving caused marked devastation and loss of life, while with respect to the labor factors, he hypothesized that this guy doesn't sound too good. It is even conceivable that it may have been more profitable for some parts of this area of West Africa to have exported the equivalent of its natural growth of population rather to have kept it at home. No indication is provided by Fagg as to the relationship between labor and development, or that between population density and a social and neutral environment. I have argued elsewhere at some length that respect to the underdevelopment tendencies of the slave trade in Upper Guinea and in Africa as a whole, slavery in the Americas was of course ultimately responsible for whatever consequences flowed from the Atlantic slave trade in Africa. But what needs to be recognized is that slave expropriation from Africa was not a system of production comparable to slavery in the New World or elsewhere, or anywhere else, in prior epochs. For Africa, the critical activity centered around the mechanism for the reduction of human beings into captives and chattel. I saw a whole bunch of things pop up, so I'm looking at it. Okay, nothing though. These mechanisms reduced or destroyed production as has graphically been illustrated by the effects of slave procurement on the gold mining industry of the Gold Coast in the 18th century. One frequently encounters African saying that people, subjects, or hands make for strength. With relatively new population densities and little labor-saving technologies, and it followed that labor rather than land was the scarce factor of reduction, to use the neoclassical formulation. In Marxist terms, the removal of human beings constituted the removal of the most important of productive forces. Sections of the current scholarly literature. So he's talking about how like these people were removed and they could have been productive forces for their own development, not being imperialized, not being taken, not like without the interaction with Europe. So what he's saying is that I think what he's saying is they lacked because people were being taken. Sections of the current scholarly literature continue to affirm that what took place in Africa was, quote, trade, and that this trade ipso facto contained development potential. John Fagg argues that, quote, in the first place, the European slave traders were traders who bought their slaves from coastal Africa merchants, end quote. More recently, A.G. Hopkins was elaborated on this theme by insisting that the exchange of human beings for commodities on the coast comprised trade, and analysis directed attention away from mode of acquiring captives. It also saves the way for the assumption that trade always benefits both parties. That is to say that That is to say, the concept of comparative advantages is accepted without questions. Yet all recent works on development on the world scale, a varying ideological perspective, confirms that, quote, unequal trade is entrenched as between development and underdeveloped countries, and hence the near universal appeal for a new international economic order. With regards to slavery, trade, and market theories, which have no power to explain the present, the present are involved to explain the past. The search for comparative advantage deriving to Africa from the trade of slaves gives rise to arguments which are both trivial and contrived. For instance, Hopkins placed great store on African production of food and provisioning slave ships. This as though the quantum would have been greater or the process more dynamic than in the case of food production and to feed the same Africans for the duration of their lives in Africa. Under colonial rule, the underdeveloping tendency persisted for as long as African production was designed primarily for the external markets, while the withdrawal of manpower as immigrant labor had been abundantly illustrated as serving to enhance backwardness and dependency in which labor is recruited. One of the principal differences between slave trading and colonialism is that the latter introduces the hegemony of capital within African society. Slavery began the destruction of the coherence of African social formations without offering any alternatives. Colonialism actively pursued the destructions while counteropposed a new coherence of capitalist structures in which 11 social formations and modes were reconstituted to confirm the capitalist market relations and ultimately wage relations. Slavery began the incorporations of Africa into the peripheries of the world system without any notable intrusions of capitalist forms inside Africa itself. Just looking back real quick. Okay, let's go on. The term periphery and core are only roughly approximations as descriptions of parts of the world economy at any given time. It is acknowledged that there were always gradations of centrality, and importance, so that the American periphery of the slavery era falls into a category different from that of the African peripheries. In the Americas, slavery undoubtedly constituted one of the modes of appropriation integral to the capitalist system, and for this reason, the discussion of slavery and underdevelopment should concentrate on the American sector. The exercise can usefully be prefaced by the indication of the essentials and recurring features of capitalist underdevelopment expressed as laws of motion of the societies concerned. Cleve Thomas offers an invaluable insight when he identifies underdevelopment and dependency as basically involving 1. The lack of an organic link between domestic resources and domestic demands, and 2, the divergence between domestic demands and the need of broad majority of the population. At this point, I will focus on an example of Guyana with the intentions of providing some specificity within the context of a broader study of transatlantic slavery. The available literature on West Indian slave plantation has usually found little difficulty in fitting Guyana into the main generalization covering the region. In Guyana, as elsewhere, sugar seems inevitable to go hand in hand with slavery. That's why every time I hear sugar plantations and stuff, I always like, oh my gosh, who are they enslaving now? You know what I mean? Every single time. Yeah, yeah, it's fucking great. Yeah. Because it says sugar seems inevitably to go hand in hand with slavery. For all practical purposes, the strip of coastlands which circumscribed the slave plantations in Guyana in the 18th century was another small island where the master-slave relationship was almost exclusive. Production in Guyana was subject to the same colonial and market constraints as were characteristics of the West Indian islands. Yet Guyana did have a peculiarity. It was not a small island in which continuous sugar growth had exhausted the cultivatable soil before or soon after slavery ended, nor was it debt-ridden and burdened by multiple mortgages by the turn of the 19th century. Just real quick, let's see how this is a long chapter. Okay. On the contrary, the soil were not easily exhaustible, and there was no question about the economic viability of the slave-based sugar industry on the eve of emancipation. The relatively large plantation units were well capitalized, and with the aid of compensation payments, the industry survived the first major market crisis of the equalization of UK sugar duties in 1846. Above all, Guyana had a substantial hinterland which set it off from the West Indian islands. There is every reason to investigate why a large continental area remained a colonial enclave during and after slavery. Guyana had large areas of living space which were not occupied by slave plantations. In these thinly populated areas, the prior communal modes of the Armenians persisted, albeit deformed under the pressures of European conquest and colonization. Slave plantations are established on the littoral, from which the indigenous Armenian population had been cleared, but the frontier was static and there was no expansion of capitalist relations or transplanted peoples into the hinterlands. Among the characteristics of Guyanese, under development, one notes the incomplete inventory and exploitation of hinterland resources and the limited nature of new settlements. These features were marked during the heyday of slavery and are to be attributed to the political economy of slavery. Slavery requires secure conditions for the reproduction of slave labor after the labor had been reintroduced. The problem of runaways varied in acuteness depending mainly on the environment. The forest areas in Guyana offered conditions no less favorable to run away than did Suriname and Brazil in the period of Dutch ascendancy. Intermingling between Armenians, and it's Ameriindians and Africans produced the mixture of I'm gonna look up this word. Why do we have the zipped mouth? What did I do? discussing African economy. Join the debate. This fucking AI thing is tripping me out. I swear. Okay, I can't say it. I think it's Bovander. Bovander. Boviandr. A term historically used to describe people of mixed Dutch and indigenous American heritage. All right, that's what that means. Okay. Communities which were highly rebellious and constituted poles of attractions for runaways. This was the experience of the 17th century when small slave plantations were established in the middle and upper reaches of the Guianians River. After the Dutch resolved upon coastal agriculture in the mid 18th century, the Guyanese economy turned. Hold on a second. Why are you yelling? Why are you yelling? Which one? Oh, okay. Did not know, Vaughn. Did not Vaughn. No. Yeah, that's why with the M word, I've been saying half white, half black with the M word. Yeah. So, was it okay? Guianians' economy turned away from the hinterlands, even the necessary activities of slaves. Oh my gosh, is this another one? ABACAK? Such as cutting palm leaves of thatch was considered dangerous since it facilitated escape. Yeah, no worries. I didn't look down and see it, so someone directed me to it. The enslavement of distant Armenian ethnicities and the importation of Africans on the large scale were compatible with the maintenance of friendly relations between European slave owners and the neighboring Amerindians communities. Indeed, the latter were. Is it the Armenian one? Is that that's okay to say, right? Latter were prevailed upon the undertake certain police functions in apprehending and returning escaped slaves. The choice of the coastal lands for the development of slave plantations was premised upon ecological factors, but having been made, this choice was reinforced by the demand of the slave system of security to the prejudice of interior development. Slavery arrived full-blown in the Guyanese coast, attracting both Dutch and English capital and settlers already in the Caribbean. There was no question of replacing independent small producers by slaves, and the rise of such cultivators was inconceivable once the slave plantation held sway. The plantation system continually sought to exercise monopoly over land and labor, and a feature which was perceptible. I can't say the dang word. My tongue is going wild. Thank you for letting me know. It didn't say in the definition that it was a slang term. So, not slang term, a slur. I wish they would have told me it was a slur, so I would have never said it. Perceptible, yeah. Only after slavery ended. Although the Guyanese history is badly under-researched. It has recently been served by two scholarly texts which address themselves to the plantation after slavery. Both confirm the previous roles of the plantation owners in the seeking to hold on to all cultivable land, and in providing, oh my gosh, decentivize. Oh, I'm gonna make sure. I'm having problems with words today. INCE. Disincentivize to any alternative economic ventures which would reduce planter dominance over the labor market. Even a casual examination of the slavery era shows that these tendencies were most pronounced, and that it was the slave-based plantation which was the principal stumbling block to the hinterland development and to the balanced development of the economy. Sorry, everybody. See here, we got 20 minutes. See where I'm at. Might be able to finish this. I'm going to finish this. Sorry, let's see how far we go over, but I'm going to finish this. Oh, Cappy Barrow's here. Hey, Cappy. Thanks for all the shit. Appreciate it. Thank you for gifting and stuff. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. After the dependent slave economy failed to utilize resources which were readily at hand within the domestic environment, while relying on the import of goods which could have derived from these same resources. The building of the coast were made from wood. Wait. The buildings of the coast were made of wood, but for the most part, that wood was not cut from the forest of Guyana. It was, the same could be said for the furniture within the houses. Oh, interesting. It was not until the 1850s that the export of greenheart was established, and several more decades passed before there was a local timber industry seeking to fulfill local demands. As late as the 1902, the administration was unable to answer a query from the colonial office as to the existence of particular woods. On that occasion, the governor observed, quote, "It is clearly unsatisfactory that we should be without complete and suitable specimens of all the woods of this colony," end quote. Thank you, Cappy. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a good life. Oh, yeah. What? You already said it. The spectacle of importing North American white pine into the forest colony was startling enough, but the policy towards the gold industry is more striking still. In spite of the El Dorado legend of the tremendous stimulus provided by the search for gold in the Americas, the gold industry in Guyana was pursued with a remarkable lack of vigor. African slaves, and that word, the one that you said that's bad, the B one, was mined gold under the direction of the Dutch in the mid 18th century. After the move to the coastal plantations, Dutch planters were apparently so fearful of competition to their plantation labor supplies that they closed gold mining operations completely. Nothing was revived until exploration resumed in 1864, and in the 1880s, the Guyanese were still rediscovering that the territory had, oh my gosh, Alivo gold. That must be a certain type of gold. I wonder what type of gold it is. Find out. Hopefully it'll let me say it too. We're about to find out. It's ALLUVIAL. Oh, it has a definition. Alluvial gold, relating to or deriving from alluvium. What the hell is alluvium? We're about to find out what alluvium is. A deposit of clay, silt, sand, and gravel left by flowing streams on river valleys or deltas, typically produce fertile soil. All right, that makes sense. All right.
Alluvial.
So alluvial gold. I'm gonna put gold in this time. I think I'm gonna put gold in. Why do they say gold afterwards? Is it a higher grade or what? I know people are probably telling me it in the comments. Alluvial gold is a gold that has been eroded from its original source and deposited in a new location by moving water, such as a riverbed, stream, okay, known as placer gold. It is also known as placer gold and is found as flakes, dust, or nuggets in loose sediment called alluvium. Okay, because gold is extremely dense. It sinks in, okay. That's why. Okay, at that point, the planter class was reluctant to release public funds to advance the gold industry. Their command over public policies and public treasuries was unchallenged during the epoch of slavery, and this ensured that slavery had profound effects in, oh my gosh, vitating? Hold on, I gotta look up on, the words are killing me today. Hold on. I'm going to finish this all out. All right.
Vitiate.
Oh, vitiating. Okay. Had profound effects in vitiating the links between. And vitiating means spoil or impair the quality or efficacy of something. Okay. All right. Production of resources based on the Guyanese situation. Underdevelopment is a form of development. Dependent, and oh wait, that's the one word. Dependent and asymmetrical, but development nonetheless within the social historical context of the capitalist world system. The slave plantations in Guyana transformed the coastal lands from thinly inhabited marshlands to productive plantation zones. This was the development of resources hitherto under development by the sparse settlements of communally organized Armenians who were farming, fishing, and hunting, while contributing to the burgeoning growth of the capitalist core. Slave plantation imposed constraints on extending capitalist relations between Guyana itself. Discussions on the precise relationship of slavery to capitalism has advanced beyond the polarization of slavery as either capitalist or non-capitalist. It is self-evident that slavery stood in the way of the commoditization of labor, and yet the internal hierarchical structure of the slave plantation was significantly influenced by the capitalist forms in Europe. At all times, slavery remained independent on the markets, financial infrastructures, and technology of the world capitalist centers. Hedonists and Hearst seek to abstract the essence of slavery in the Americas as follows, and here's what they say. They say, it It is a mode of production subordinate to the capitalist mode of production within the international division of labor, and the world market creates, by capitalism, the conditions of reproductions of the slave mode of production. Under these circumstances depend upon the capitalist system, upon the world demand for the commodities it produces, competing regions and methods of production, alternative sources of investment, etc. Paul, Begulaman supplied and effectively defines modern New World slavery as, quote, capitalist slavery, end quote. While Cleve Thomas emphasizes another crucial dimension when he designates it as a, quote, colonial slave mode of production, end quote, giving the fact that colonialism became, quote, the mediator structure through which the influences of emerging capitalism in Europe were transmitted, end quote. There is a wide area of agreement that slavery was an essential component of peripheral capitalism, and that as such, it could not develop enough internal momentum to ensure that its surpluses were used for the development of capitalism in the interior, such as Guyana. For sugar, there was only one market, which lay more often than not in a single metropolitan center. The nature of surplus realization imposed a relentless dependency on the planter class vis-a-vis the metropoles. Dependency is a colonial characteristics, but it must be noted that slavery in the colonies was bound to be heavily dependent, because the slave economy stood no chance of creating an internal market. The tide market was also a source of capital and credit. Commercial and financial institutions were never autonomous within Guyana. Technology too was externally deprived, and there was little room for innovation or even adaptation of the type which could be termed developmental. Improvements to factory technology were very slow in coming to Guyana, while field husbandry remained wedded to the utilization of heavy inputs of cheap labor. In this unique study of Cuban sugar technology, Manuel Marino, Fraginals, I can't say it, Fraginals, Fraginals, makes it clear that the major source of inducing growth in the 18th century Cuba was more manpower and slavery, in contrast to metropolitan capitalism, which lacked the dynamic to constantly revolutionize production methods. These remarks are also applicable to Guyana. There was a proliferation of artisan skills in the Guyanese, I can't say it, slave plantation, and there was slaves who mastered the boiling of sugar. But of course, they were not exposed to scientific principles or experimentations. Besides, sugar technology was industry specific and confirmed the monoculture dimensions of the economy. The slave planters pursued policies which made it impossible for other branches of economic activity, to be established, and they were able to create barriers to the free entry of capital into agriculture, industry, and distribution. The legal essence of slavery, ownership and legal coercion, and its political expression in a narrow planter-controlled state, both contributed to holding back the development of Guyana. The local state institutions under planter management were weak in their relations to the external world, but they were powerful instruments in the hands of the masters for use against the slaves. The plantocracy, which is plantation. The plantocracy, hello, thank you for dropping in, was given free reign in its domestic policies. Without the domestic market and forms of petty commodities, production intermediary strata were extremely weak and closely tied to the planter class. Obviously, slavery stood in the way of the emergence of wage-earning proletariats. But in addition, it also inhibited the growth of other classes and stratas associated with the maturation of capitalism in the metropoles. Initially, reference was made to the necessity to premise the evaluation of slavery on the contemporary underdevelopment. It is, however, just and important to pursue the historical inquiry into the post-slavery decades of the 19th century, where continuity and change gave meaning to previous trends. For nearly 100 years, sugar planters bitterly resisted the creation of a free labor market as implied by emancipation. They succeeded with the metropolitan backing in importing indentured labor from various sources and having that labor force heavily subsidized from state revenue, briefly in 1848, and then systematically from 1846. The planters organized large-scale state-aided immigration from India until the last indentureship terminated in 1921. Planters remained a strategic section of the labor force of fixed wages and contracts outside of the labor market. Their efforts were directed against the emergence of the proletariat, which would make industrial and social demands on the owners of capital. Inevitably, the free section of the labor force found its initiatives frustrated by the immense control which planters wield other indentured workers, and hence the ease with which those workers were deployed to break the unity of working class struggle. Increasingly enough, planters resistance against the commoditization, I can't say it. Commoditization, that's hard for me, of labor was spearheaded in the late 19th, and they're gonna say century, oh no worries, 19th century, by the plantation. Okay, we have we have 3 more pages left, everybody, and we'll be done. By the centuries of plantation companies, which were integral part of the new monopoly forms of imperialist era. The post-slavery plantation also showed a determination to retain the monopoly over the land and to keep agricultural land in particular from coming into the market. The conditions of tenure of the, quote, front lands of the coastal strip were such that each estate had an automatic option of the backlands, quote unquote, of potential pondular husbandry. What is pondular? Poldler. What the hell's poldler? I'm gonna find it out. Oh, we're gonna find that out. Come on. Thank you. I don't even know if I'm saying it right. Polder husbandry. So polder means a piece of low-lying and reclaimed from the sea or the river and protected by dikes, especially in the Netherlands. Okay. Pondular husbandry. Until these options were taken up, the land belonged to the crown, as did the forest and the savannas of the interior. Planters moved quickly to raise the price at which crown land could be sold to the prohibitives level. I gotta look this word up. One of these days I'll get the 3 pages done. I gotta make sure I know this word. Sorry everybody, I'm having word problems today. I gotta hear it. Prohibitive levels. There we go. Prohibitive levels, and to restrict the terms under which it could be leased. These measures blocked new plantation capitalist development of the land, and they militated severely against the emergence of the peasantry. Nevertheless, it is equally important to recognize that the planter monopoly over the land and labor was breached in the 19th century, and that growth and development registered in the post-slavery epoch were due precisely to the small ways in which the monopoly had been successfully challenged. Ex-slaves immediately assumed the roles of a modern proletariat and presenting their own terms for wage and conditions of work. They did not make a great deal of headway in the face of state-aided indentured immigration, but their wage level was usually slightly higher than that of indentured bondsmen, whose rate was 1 shilling per day, remained unchanged from 1838 to 1921. African enslaved moved into variety of occupations in the villages and towns, and to some extent in the hinterlands also. Their first objective was not to escape from state employment, but they at least supplemented estate earnings by functioning part-time as artisans and in petty commodity self-employment on one sort or another. Ex-indentured Indians from India, Chinese, and oh my gosh, Madurians people took similar routes. One infers from all this extraordinary importance of legal coercion in the slavery epoch. Recent research has firmly concluded that it was the plantation structure that was the key element of the underbelly of Guyana. This should be modified and the emphasis shifted to the slave mode of production, colonial and capitalist, with which the plantation was first associated. The plantation remains a factor inducing backwardness, mainly to the extent that legal economic extraction of surplus did continue after slavery. But the new situation lacked the comprehensiveness of slavery and was slowly undermined by wage labor. Former slaves and ex-indentured workers were able to express their own demands for goods and services. Their demands created an internal market for land and houses, as well as for food, clothing, and other consumer items. The immediate post-slavery activities of Africans in Guyana have long been a subject of scholarly attention, but misapprehensions still prevail. In general, the first post-emancipation decade is present as the era in which ex-slaves fled the plantations and set themselves up as peasants in villages. This simplifies and virtually inverts the reality in which Africans were still primarily sugar workers, but had withdrawn their residence from the estates housings and were making demands to support their conception of a tolerable standard of living. Demands which include higher wages, education, and access to cultivable land for those who wished to become full-time or part-time agricultural producers, for local consumption, distribution, and other service sectors, expanding because of these post-slavery trends, and intermediary classes began to make their presence felt. However, slow hinterland development development may have been in the 19th century. It was only possible because of the energy released by emancipation. A wage earners and as petty entrepreneurs, former plantation workers were responsible for the growth of the timber and mining industries. When the middle strata acquired a small economy based outside the direct control of the plantations, they also started to challenge the political hegemony, last page, which restricted their further growth. A new constitution in 1891 was the consequence of protracted populist agitation on the part of all stratas outside the planter class. Legislators were therefore elected on a slightly widening franchise, and they were persuaded to remove some of the stumbling blocks towards the acquisition of crown land, towards the establishment of a peasant-based rice industry, and towards the development of a gold and diamond mining industry. Once more, the role of the state services to emphasize the historical significance of the political exclusiveness, which necessarily went along with slavery in Guyana and wherever slavery was not merely one institution, but the basis of a peripheral capitalism in any given territory. Because New World slavery was a colonial phenomenon, it is sometimes difficult to separate a specific consequences of slavery from those which accrued from colonialism. The evidence in Guyana seems to support the conclusion that underdevelopment tendencies can uniquely be identified with slavery. First, when they relate to the central fact that labor was not a commodity, and to the absence of effort to achieve this, in contrast to primitive accumulation when indigenous pre-capitalist societies were colonized in Africa and Asia. And second, when the tendencies stem from the monopoly over the land and labor in the hands of slave owners, one places restraint on the development of others forms of private property. This again falls short of being a common feature of colonialism per se. The colonial state, in the history of capitalism, guaranteed slavery or migrant labor or peasant production depend upon the mode of labor appropriation which involved. But the colonial slave state was more monolithic than others because there were no complete class interests which had to be reconciled at the level of the state, and because uncompromising authoritarianism was necessary to reproduce the relationship between master and slave. And that's it. And then we'll go on to the pedagogy of ours, and it will be the first chapter 10, British colonialist schools of Africa, historiography, and the question of African dependency. That will be the next. What page? We stopped on page 169. 169. That's not a long one either. So we're going to get into like educational in the colonial Africa. They're going to talk about how the educational system doesn't talk about their material conditions, but the material conditions of like Europe instead. Horrible. You know, you think you teach them education in Africa, contemporary Tanzania. That's going to be different though. The Tanzania one's going to be different. That has more stopping points too. I can't wait to read on Tanzania. It's a good one. It's a good one. You know? So, yeah. Ujamaa and scientific socialism. That's going to be a good one too. Chapter 13. I know Gray likes Nyerere and Tanzania. I don't know if they're here. Yeah, I'm about to. If no one wants to come up and talk about what I read, it can talk about what I read. But if no one wants to come up and talk about what I read, that's fine too. But they're talking about how slavery is acquired to underdevelopment and stuff like that. it's a lot I have to also process myself. You know what I mean? Sure, but I don't know who's gonna come up, so I'm gonna give it a little bit of time here. Because I don't think Dooley's here. No, Dooley, no one else is here, so yeah. Class contradictions in Tanzania. So we got a little bit ways to go here. We got how many chapters? Transition. Ooh. 15. Yep, they got all the way to 300. All right. So I'll go ahead and put a bookmark on this, and it was a good read. It was a good read. I don't know. I don't know why we're about to close it out, my friend. But you're welcome to stay up here. I can give it a couple minutes. See if anyone wants to give you any coins. So I'll give you a couple minutes. We'll give it a couple minutes. But yeah, slavery destroys even the capitalist mode of production. Like, they didn't want to like get away from the usage of that, and then they had to. So it was great. I'll give them about a minute, and if not, I'll close it out. Thank you, everybody, for reading along, or listening at least, and being a little bit bored, but I like it. I think it's fascinating. Yeah. What? Progressive Americans are arguing that slavery is ethical? Where is that at? The fuck? Where the fuck's that at? Where the fuck is that at? Jesus. Can't believe they're doing that. It must be white progressives. Well, scratch a lib and, fash, and everything. On TikTok. God damn. On TikTok. That's fucking wild. That's fucking wild. What the fuck? The American dollar is gone. It's fucking gonzo. It's gonzo. No one wants the American dollar anymore. No one wants our American debt. They're going somewhere else. So like, is America going like, oh my God, we got to start a slave system now? Oh my gosh, do you think that's? Oh my God. What? They say because the victim would be paying for their enslavement. Oh my God. What the fuck? Oh, that part you want to talk to me about? If you want to, you can come up, talk about it. I can always get Rufus's food ready to go. It's up to you. Their incarceration. Okay. Yes, incarceration people are enslaved. Yes, I agree. So like making more. Okay. Yeah. Post-slavery Ghana discuss effects. The effects is that they moved them. They got some type of good things, but then still put into being extractive and doing the deeds of the imperialist capitalists. You know what I mean? That helped me. But yeah. Oh, I think it would be best if we talk about it. On my page. Okay, on your page. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to close it out, everybody, then. All right. Thank you for all the likes. Jesus Christ, 13 likes. 13K likes. I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, mental liberals do too. Yeah. All right, here we go. All right, everybody. Yeah, no wrong.